So this actually special dialogue event was actually as the background of the 50 years anniversary of course, Dr. Kissinger's visit to China, but also started the 50 years of exchanges with China and between China and the US, United States. But this year is also the 50 years of China joining United Nations.
Yes, I was there in 1975. Three of my siblings and I visited for 5 weeks. We were in Beijing for 4 weeks and then traveled with my mother by train to Wuxi, Nanjing, and Shanghai. And it has been a remarkable thing to sit on the sidelines and to witness this incredible growth that China has experienced over the past 46 years when I was first there. The China I saw in 1975, and I don't want to be offensive to anyone, but was basically freedomless. Everyone was equal. They were equally poor. And that people were friendly towards us. We rode our bikes all over the place, and we were treated very kindly. But there was propaganda machines everywhere. Everywhere you go, the word was being spouted out. People were still being sent at the end of the Cultural Revolution, being sent to the countryside, and people couldn't make daily choices that clearly they can make today. And so, looking back 46 years later, if I were back in 1975, I couldn't have predicted or imagined that China would have had hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty, that the middle class would be growing as rapidly as it is, that the economy continues to churn out new jobs and crank out wealth for people, that people would enjoy daily freedoms that frankly back then were clearly unimaginable, happening in China. So I've been deeply impressed by this, Henry. I'll be honest with you. And I think one of the things that separates me from other folks is the fact that I've been there and seen it grow over the many years. I've come to some deep conclusions. One, there's no single system that works for every country, that every country needs to develop a system that is suitable and fitting for the conditions of that country. I mentioned high-speed rail. I mean, other countries, other developed countries, or even developing countries in the world have not been able to keep up with China in the deployment of high-speed rail. And I've been on many train rides that have been very efficient. They're quiet, they're fast, they're clean. And there's a leapfrog capability that China is enjoying that really sets it apart in many respects. Anyway, so yeah, it's gone from bicycles to the car consuming capital of the world, and also now leapfrog to the high speed rail.
I think if I were summarizing it in kind of one idea or one sentence, it would be that when I first visited China in the 1980s, I think the average citizen didn't feel that they had a lot of control over their own destiny with respect to these myriad really important decisions in their personal lives. But now, and certainly I think since the 1990s and unquestionably today, the average Chinese citizen, I think, feels that they have vastly more ability to shape their future than they did in the 1970s, 1980s, and so on. So it has been an incredible transformation. And of course, that's to say nothing of the physical transformation that's occurred in China and that you, Henry, and Neil were just discussing. At the Bush China Foundation, or the George H.W. Bush Foundation for US-China Relations, our mission is to advance the US-China relationship in ways that reflect the ethos, spirit, and values of President George H.W. Bush. And as you mentioned at the outset, when Neil founded the George H.W. Bush Foundation for US-China Relations with the blessing and support of his father, George H.W. Bush, that was very much the mindset. And I am so honored to be able to work side by side with Neil to carry forward the George H.W. Bush vision for the relationship. Henry, you mentioned one of President George H.W. Bush's most famous quotes when it comes to China, and it's one that we talk about all the time at the foundation. But I want to note that fundamentally, the George H.W. Bush vision for the relationship is grounded in two beliefs, core beliefs, I would say. Number one, that the US-China relationship is the single most consequential bilateral relationship in the world. And in fact, I would say in the history of the world. And number two, that no major international problem or challenge can be enduringly resolved in the absence of effective US-China cooperation.
Absolutely. I mean, the Bush China Foundation has done many things. I noticed in the last 2 years, actually several years, you've done the conferences, you've done webinars related with many areas. So exactly, we need this foundation to actually to have better understanding and promote exchanges between our two countries.
Henry, I'd like to piggyback off of that comment by reminding you and others that my dad, after he retired from the presidency, chose to be active in establishing dialogue, much like your program, Henry, between China and the United States. And he did so in the form of a conference, a US-China relations conference that he co-hosted with an old friend, Madam Li Xiaolin, on the Chinese side. That conference he attended, he actively promoted, he brought in, representation from the US side, the Chinese side, brought in equal representation. And I think he attended 5 or 6, David, do you recall? But he attended and hosted 5 or 6 of those. So that was basically the founding of our organization. Now, those are the roots of where our organization, sprouted from. And as he got older and couldn't actually participate in these conferences, he asked me to chair from the U.S. side. And it just spun out of that spun the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations. And he was very pleased to see that the programmatic activity, starting with what he started, the conference, has now expanded to many other areas under David's very, very capable leadership.
But somehow, unfortunately, for the last several years, I mean, probably the last 5 years, particularly since Republican President Trump took the office, we see China-U.S. relations somehow, deteriorate quite a bit, and so this kind of deterioration, we don't know what are the reasons, but definitely, even now President Biden comes up, they're still saying, okay, China probably is somewhat better now, but still, they say China can be cooperative, can compete, but also can be a rivalry. So we don't want to be a rivalry. But also President Trump started this trade war, trade sanction with China. We see many Republicans actually calling for lift those tariffs. As I was just talking recently with Randy Cutler, the former acting USTR, and she was saying, maybe we should lift those tariffs. It's no good for China, so for US as well. And recently, US-China Business Council have done a survey that find this tariff actually cost US almost 250,000 jobs and many costs. But still, China and US trade is still China imported as much as increasing still, and also the trade has increased. So what do you assess this current China-US relations, and how we can really improve that? How we can really maybe get a bit normalcy there, rather than we are now in such kind of deteriorated position. And of course, also I've been talking with a number of U.S. opinion leaders like Graham Allison, Joseph Nye, and of course John Thornton just recently, and of course think tank heads and Susan Thornton and Ambassador Roy. I mean, many of them. They all say, we shouldn't have a Cold War. We should not decouple, and they have all that kind of a consensus. Of course, how can both countries work better towards a better relation, given your foundation's view, maybe your personal view as well?
First of all, you referenced the deterioration in the relationship. And it strikes me that there are a number of converging factors that have led to the U.S. side becoming fearful of China's rise, and that fear is reflected in rhetoric that has become, under the Trump administration, quite harsh. And with that became kind of an isolationist approach of stepping back and not having dialogue. My dad believed at his core that, that countries and families and friends, need to stay in touch with one another in order to better understand one another, in order to put yourself in the other guy's shoes, so that when conflict arises, you can address those conflicts in a mature way. We got away from that for 5 years or so, and maybe even prior to that. David can give his analysis. That coupled with the U.S. problem of kind of America first, build the wall, anti-immigrant, we're the greatest country on the face of the planet, and to see China's economic rise to where it's now at parity or just behind the U.S. economy on a gross basis, not per capita, but on a gross basis. There are a lot of politicians are fearful of losing our prominence in that way. And then a third factor is politically, given that there's not very good information about China floating around in this ecosystem in the U.S. Politically, China's an easy target. We see politicians blasting the Communist Party as though it was the party that was kind of manifested itself in different ways very early in the People's Republic of China's history. So there's a lot of China bashing, and it gets to the Thucydides trap issue, that as China rises and America being the prominent power in the world, faces this rising power, how are we going to react? And a lot of people in our country, many politicians, are reacting quite poorly to it and thinking that China is a existential threat to our economic and to our national security. And by the way, I'll quickly hasten to add that clearly any bilateral relationship is going to have issues between countries. We have issues with France, we have issues with Germany, we have issues with Israel, we have issues with our closest friends. We're going to have issues with China, and we're going to address, as Americans, we have values that we stand firmly behind. We're going to express those values in a way, hopefully in a way that's respectful and not finger pointing or in a derogatory way, but we'll express our values in the hopes that we can help shape outcomes and that kind of thing. But the ultimate goal should be to come together as often as possible in as many different ways as possible, and to resolve challenges, respectfully and maturely. I'm going to let David, talk about the tariffs thing. My view of the tariffs is it was such a stupid idea to start with. The idea of raising tariffs that was a tax to American consumers, hurting American business, which, David can get into the statistics. I mean, it was a non-starter. Trump's idea, and I think people behind Trump, their idea was that if we have a trade deficit with a country, we've got to redress that by putting up tariffs and, balancing out the trade. The reality is that in global trade, some countries have goods that are good quality goods that are provided at a lower cost that richer countries want to buy. And poorer countries, developing countries, can't afford to buy the stuff from the poorer countries. So therefore, there's going to be a trade imbalance, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing in economics 101 that says that a trade imbalance is unnatural or inappropriate or bad. And so it was a silly thesis in the first place. I think it may have been deep down inside, the logic might have been to be punitive towards the Chinese, to try to set the Chinese economy back. But that was illogical as well. So it was a failed policy that needs to be reversed. And anyway, David, I'll let you clean up my mess. Go ahead.
Just to pick up on the really good points that Neil made about tariffs. I mean, Neil and I both, even before we met each other 3 years ago, were both, very much very critical of the U.S. policy on tariffs and the Trump tariffs. On the same grounds that they're bad for America. They're bad for American companies. They're bad for American workers. They kill jobs. They blow out the deficit, and they do nothing to solve any of the core problems that actually do exist between the United States and China in the trade area. And I agree fully with everything Neil just said with respect to tariffs. And we as individuals and as a foundation have been very outspoken, maybe more outspoken than almost any other entity in the country when it comes to the how bad for America the tariffs are. Let me cite a couple of things, and then I'll move, Henry, to the broader question that you've asked. But I think this needs to be said. I mean, the numbers are in, the jury is in with respect to the tariffs. We don't have to speculate or offer opinions about it. We can actually look at the factual record. Under President Trump, we had the highest US trade deficit with China in American history. Under President Trump, we had the highest average annual merchandise trade deficit with China of any presidency in the history. So to compare apples to apples, the entire presidency, the average annual deficit with China was higher under Trump than any other previous presidency. So those numbers speak for themselves. It wasn't just a one-year wonder type of phenomenon. It was 4 years. The U.S. trade deficit with the world grew to record levels under President Trump. We lost manufacturing jobs, tens of thousands of them under President Trump. We lost jobs overall, 250,000, as Neil just cited, from the U.S.-China Business Council under these imbecilic policies. The historic U.S. trade surplus with China in agriculture became a trade deficit for the first time in 25 years, something that none of us thought was even possible.
For the last 5-6 years, there seems to be more misunderstanding between the two countries. And I think we all need to really work hard to really to get a dialogue, get a communication, and get the right understanding. Exactly like what we're doing tonight as well. And I think that trade is absolutely so obvious